So this is an incantation bowl, also called a Babylonian devil trap, and it was used between the 2nd and the 7th century AD, mainly by Hebrew people, but as the name suggests, it comes from like Babylonian practices. These bowls were usually terracotta, and they had this ink script written into them, and then in the center was usually a depiction of a demon bound in chains. These bowls were used by burying them underground, under the foundations of a house, especially where there were cracks, and they buried them upside down, so the bowl part was like facing down, so any demons coming from like the underworld would be trapped inside of the seal and the spell of the incantation bowl. The main demon that these bowls were made to protect against is Lilith, and you'll see her depicted as an owl because that's usually how she was personified. The kind of format that we usually see on these is like the names of everyone in the house and their like role in the house, like mother, daughter, husband, and so on. And then usually you invoke a good spirit like Solomon or Metatron or some other powerful angel. And then you talk about like what you're protecting against, and then usually the name of the demon, and then you have these sort of ritual like spell incantations. And I'll read an example of one. Bound is the bewitching Lilith with a peg of iron in her nose. Bound is the bewitching Lilith with pincers of iron in her mouth. Bound is the bewitching Lilith with a chain or iron on her neck. And you get the idea, it goes on like that for a while. And iron was usually used as the like material of the chains because it was thought to bound the demons. So these protective charms mainly defended the house from spirits, and since they were mainly targeted against Lilith, it protected infants, mothers, and the men of the house primarily. And we can talk about Lilith in another video if you guys want. So this is Lilith, and she's a female demon that comes from Mesopotamian folklore. And what she does is strangle children, make women have complications in childbirth, and seduce men to collect their seed in order to produce demon children. So she actually falls under a motif or an archetype of a night mother. And what we see is in almost every culture around the world, there are similar characters to Lilith. Everything from European, African, Asian, Middle Eastern, North and South American cultures all have similar characters as Lilith. So the Lilith we know comes from the Babylonian group of demons called the Lilitu, and these were essentially the same thing as Lilith. They went around making men and women infertile and impotent. So depending on which text you're referencing, Lilith is sometimes depicted as the serpent that tempted Adam and Eve in the garden. Sometimes she is Adam's first wife. And still others, she's married to other types of demons. So the name Lilith in Hebrew numerology equates to screeching, and that's why oftentimes she's depicted as an owl or having bird-like features, because she's often the screeching demon of the night. So the ailments associated with Lilith are men's seed being spilled at night, what we would call wet dreams, the strangulation of children, especially newborns, and then complications of mothers or infertility in mothers for childbirth. What she's associated might sound a little nonsensical to us. How are a newborn being killed in its sleep at night the same as a man just having a wet dream? And to answer that question, you need to understand the fertility cult origins of these people, especially like the Hebrews and the Mesopotamians. Their religions, which are coming from fertility cults, valued anything that had to do with reproduction and reproductive fluids. The idea of demons, and especially Lilith, today have been romanticized to be these kind of sensual seductionists. Ultimately, this comes from their role as fertility demons, which we're going to talk about more of. So the word cult comes from a word that would mean cultivate, to grow things, to take care of things. This is why we call it agriculture. This is why we call them fertility cults, because they were cults. They were farming cults. They would grow things together with certain rituals. Some of the oldest religions, they come from fertility cults, including the Hebrew religion, where we have Lilith as a primary antagonist. So the idea of sinning in the Hebrew religion stems from the spilling of seed and the waste of seed. And this is what a sin is. What a curse is the infertility in a woman or the loss of a child in a woman. So if you are cursed, you are infertile, and if you are sinning, you are wasting your seed. And this is why today in Christianity, which comes from Hebrew, which comes from fertility cults, why their stances on birth control and marriage and relations in general are the way they are, is because it's not about the morality of the act, it's about the misuse of seed. But that's just to connect it to our modern times, because all of these things kind of reverberate throughout time, and we can trace back where and why we think this way. And for Christianity, comes from this idea that sinning or spilling your seed is an offense against God, against yourself, and against nature. So for a demon like Lilith to encourage that, or to tempt men into that, and to kill your children and cause infertility in women, is super important to try to combat, because your whole religion is based off of this idea of fertility. And this is like the antithesis of that. And this is why she was such a prevalent demon, or such a prevalent character in mythology and folklore. And this is why you had the incantation bowls were so important, or things like that. Different charms and different talismans were invented to try to keep her at bay. So now that we have an idea of this demonic force, Lilith, and the incantation bowls, we can now ask the question, what is actually going on here? Why did these people believe this? Is it just some wild, primitive superstition, or is there actually something more going on? So this is going to be groundbreaking information. This is potentially going to change everything how we think about the world, especially this sort of like more metaphysical stuff. So what Lilith is, what she represents as a demon, is quite simply mold. Lilith, in this example, is a personification of black mold, or some sort of mold, or just the general effects of mold, right? The sickening effects. Now you need to understand that these people, they didn't have access to microscopes. All they could observe was that there was some sort of physical force that would cause sickness. We know it today as a pathogen or a infection. To them, there was some supernatural, invisible, angry entity, force coming for them. Specifically for Lilith, they personified the death of a child, or the loss of seed from a man at night, or the pain of childbirth for the mother. They personified those effects. And those effects we can see now as being some sort of fungal or bacterial infection that they didn't have the right resources to find, but they still described it accurately. Lilith is a female owl snake creature. The snake represents how she comes from the underworld. This is exactly where spores are going to come from. The owl aspect
and the female aspect represents how she is a creature of the night and how she is capable of flight. Spores grow and spread during the night mainly because sunlight kills them. So it has to be at night, and they get around by flying. And keep in mind, they believed that it had to get in through the house physically. So this demonic spiritual force was still bound by physical laws. So they covered the cracks up and they tried to purify themselves every time they came into the house. This is because there is a physical quality to the demons that they tried to describe. Another point of clarification is when I'm talking about fungus, I'm mainly speaking about the Ascomycetes family of fungus, which is your more spore-based, like yeast and mold and sac fungi and stuff like that, and not so much mushrooms and like magic mushrooms. That may be what you're thinking. That has a different role, but we're mainly talking about these sort of pathogenic decomposers. This may take a minute to make sense, but in early human culture, one of the most important things we needed to be able to do within our early settlements, our first agricultural communities, we needed to be able to reliably ferment alcohol. Fermenting alcohol is why we settled into communities, why we stopped being nomads, and why we settled. And the fermentation process is not exactly a guarantee. Now, for us today, we have cultured our fermenting yeast so that you can just add it to whatever you're trying to brew. And even then, there's a small amount of variables that could cause a bad batch, like an infection of bacteria, or if you just over ferment it into vinegar. But for the ancient people, when they were first trying to ferment, they needed a way to start acquiring that culture of yeast. Of course, what they ended up doing was throwing parties for the fermentation, the spirits of the fermentation, right? The spirits of the brew, the gods that bestowed the fermentation process onto their water and fruit that they could use to purify and to save resources and to also give them nutrients they couldn't get anywhere else as a byproduct of the fermentation process. But the way in which they guaranteed fermentation, which we needed for survival as a settled group of humans, we needed that reliable method of fermentation. And what they did was they threw festivals, they held sacred meditation, they sang and they danced for the fermentation to take hold in their bowls or caskets or barrels or whatever they were trying to ferment in. So we became successful as a species in settled communities because we sang, depending on your culture, we sang or danced for yeast to ferment. That was the reliable way in which we survived our early fertility agriculture communities. So start with the pinned videos on my channel if you're seeing this and go through the order for this to make sense. So from the previous video, we learned that through intention and will and words and singing and dancing, we were able to reliably ferment alcohol, which of course reveals some sort of influence or connection to this fungal or microbial consciousness or network or just intelligence that seems to be present in the world. And so you see there is a basis for why this works, why something like a spell or a charm or a talisman can help fight off evil spirits, because these evil spirits are in fact personifications of pathogenic fungus and bacteria, which can be fought off using words and intentions. So there does exist an experiment called the rice consciousness experiment or the water consciousness experiment, wherein you take different jars of cooked rice, I believe it's cooked, and you put water in it, and then you put a label. So you attach a intention and a meaning to each jar. Now what you do is you wait for mold to grow. So let's say after several weeks, you start to get different kinds of mold based on the sort of label, depending on how toxic it becomes, or how pleasant or aromatic and structured, and how aggressive it is can change based off of your intention. Now, the proponents of this experiment, they say that it's about water consciousness, about how there's this water consciousness that's affected by us in the same way. Now, I don't know if that's true. Maybe it is. I don't think that experiment proves this. I think this experiment, at the very least, indicates that fungal consciousness, that fungal connection that our intentions can influence and affect. So a streamlined version of this test we can do, all of us can do this. Certainly if thousands of us do this, we could quickly prove this really fast. Just take bread, put it in 3 different jars just like this, and wait to see what kind of mold grows. See what your intentions, maybe you play music, maybe you talk to it, maybe you just have a label. It's the same thing they used to ferment alcohol. It's just the intention of trying to influence and communicate with the mold and the spores that will take root in everything at some point as they decompose everything naturally, right?